The Resident Evil franchise has been telling one continuous story of biological horror for almost 30 years, and the full timeline is absolutely unhinged. We're talking aristocratic eugenicists, secret military deals, parasitic cults, cities nuked off the map, and a fungal hive mind that ties it all together. This is the complete Resident Evil timeline, every major event explained. And it starts with 3 rich guys who went on a hiking trip and brought back the end of the world. The 1960s to 1970s, Umbrella's foundations. Here's the thing about Umbrella Corporation. It wasn't built by mad scientists in a secret bunker. It was built by 3 wealthy university classmates who bonded over a shared interest in eugenics. Oswell E. Spencer, Dr. Edward Ashford, and Dr. James Marcus, 3 old money aristocrats convinced they could engineer a superior human race. That's how the deadliest corporation in gaming history started, a philosophy club with a trust fund. But what turned their ambitions from theoretical to terrifyingly real was a flower. In 1966, Marcus theorized that a West African plant called the Stairway of the Sun had mutagenic properties capable of rewriting human biology. So he traveled to the Indapaya tribal lands, found an underground garden hidden beneath ancient ruins, and in December 1966, isolated what would become known as the progenitor virus. Spencer saw the potential immediately, but not just for science. He struck a secret deal with the US military to produce progenitor-based biological weapons, while transforming Umbrella from a rich man's science project into a global bioweapons manufacturer hiding behind pharmaceutical sales. But here's where the darkness kicks in early. Dr. Edward Ashford died in 1968, killed by his own prototype T-virus. Officially an accident. Unofficially, Spencer almost certainly orchestrated it to seize full control. The man murdered his co-founder within 2 years of launch. And the twisted irony is that Ashford's death actually accelerated the T-virus project, because Spencer used the tragedy to consolidate all research under his direct oversight. By the early 1980s, Umbrella's Arklay laboratory had become the company's crown jewel, pioneering bioorganic weapons. What started as 3 aristocrats with a dangerous hobby was now a multinational empire with military contracts, secret labs, and a body count that was only just getting started. And that Arklay laboratory, it's about to become ground zero for the single worst night in survival horror history. July 1998, Arklay Mountains / Spencer's cleanup. The most famous haunted house in gaming history exists because one man decided destroying evidence was easier than actually cleaning up his mess. On May 11th, 1998, a containment accident at the Arklay laboratory released the T-virus into the Spencer mansion. Not into a city, not into the open air, into a single building hidden deep in the Arklay Mountains, and for 2 full months, nobody outside Umbrella knew it was happening. But here's where it gets disturbing. During those 2 months, the infection crept through the mansion like a slow tide. Lab staff stopped reporting for shifts. Researchers who were alive on Monday were eating their co-workers by Friday. The MA-39 Cerberus bioweapons, T-virus infected dogs, broke containment and started hunting through Raccoon Forest, attacking hikers, campers, anyone unlucky enough to be in the woods. And Umbrella's response to all of this was to cover it up. Meetings were held, memos were written, bodies piled up. Corporate kept the lights off and hoped it would burn itself out. It didn't. By the time the dust settled, 127 people were dead. 78 Umbrella employees, 23 test subjects, 20 civilians from Raccoon City, and 7 Raccoon Police Department officers. But here's the part that changes everything about how you read this story. On July 25, 1998, Oswell Spencer authorized the demolition of the entire Arklay laboratory and Spencer mansion, not to contain the virus, to destroy evidence of Umbrella's illegal bioweapons program. He sent STARS in to do it. And there's a strong fan theory that Spencer had a second motive. He wasn't just using STARS to blow the place up, he was using them as lab rats, collecting live combat data on how T-virus specimens performed against trained military operatives. The company watched its own police force get hunted through hallways full of monsters and took notes. The worst part? Spencer's solution was catastrophically counterproductive. The demolition released concentrated viral specimens into the surrounding environment and left behind survivors who had seen everything. Umbrella didn't bury the problem. They scattered it across an entire region. And if you think that's bad, wait until you see what happened when that virus reached Raccoon City 2 months later. September to October, 1998, Raccoon City destruction. Every disaster in this timeline traces back to one man making one selfish decision. Dr. William Birkin spent years developing the G-virus for Umbrella, a pathogen capable of repairing dead tissue and theoretically creating superhumans. It was the most valuable bioweapon on the planet, but when Umbrella moved to take it from him, Birkin panicked and tried to sell his research to the US military instead. Bad move? Umbrella had a mole embedded inside the military, and the second Birkin's betrayal was flagged, they sent an execution squad to kill him. But here's where the domino chain starts, because Birkin didn't just die. He survived long enough to inject himself with G virus samples, us mutating into a monstrous chimera that barely resembled anything human. Then, in what was either a final act of spite or pure desperation, he smashed open the remaining virus briefcases in the underground lab. That contaminated Raccoon City's entire sewage and water infrastructure. The T-virus spread through the pipes, into the taps, into the population. And Umbrella's response made everything worse. They deployed weaponized BOWs throughout the city to contain the outbreak, which is like fighting a house fire by throwing more fire at it. The creatures introduced additional infected vectors into civilian neighborhoods, accelerating transmission at a rate nobody could control. By September 24th, 1998, the Pentagon had boots on the ground, telling the media it was a radioactive leak. The government imposed martial law and set up highway checkpoints, locked the city down, but it was already too late. Hundreds of infected residents had slipped out before the perimeter was established. On October 1st, 1998, President Clinton authorized Operation Eradication, a thermobaric missile strike that obliterated Raccoon City and killed an estimated 100,000 people, infected and uninfected alike. The American government nuked its own civilians, but here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. The US government already knew about the T-virus. They had a contractual relationship with Umbrella, they had foreknowledge of the bioweapons, and after they bombed 100,000 of their own citizens, they classified everything, specifically to prevent China from accessing effective bioweapon construction protocols. They didn't cover it up because they were ashamed. They covered it up because the research was still valuable. One scientist's betrayal led to a corporate hit squad, which led to a contaminated water supply, which led to a zombie city, which led to the government erasing 100,000 lives, and then lying about why. Every single decision made the situation worse, and nobody was held accountable for any of it. But if Raccoon City was the moment the world should have woken up to what Umbrella had created, what happened 2 months later proved that the nightmare was just getting started. December 1998, Rockfort Island/Antarctic incident. So Raccoon City is a smoking crater. Umbrella is hemorrhaging personnel, assets, and credibility. And the brilliant solution their surviving operatives came up with: ship everything to a remote island in the South Pacific. Prisoners, viral samples, infected specimens, all of it, crammed onto transports headed for Rockfort Island, Umbrella's paramilitary headquarters, and, because subtlety was never their strong suit, a literal concentration camp facility. But here's where it gets complicated. Umbrella wasn't just collapsing from the outside, it was being looted from within. In December 1998, the HCF, Umbrella's own quasi-independent security division, launched a full-scale infiltration of Rockfort Island. Their target was the T. veronica virus, a progenitor strain developed by Dr. Alexia Ashford that could do something no other virus in Umbrella's arsenal had managed. Let infected hosts keep their minds, cognitive function intact, superhuman transformation included. That kind of research was worth more than the island itself, but the raid went sideways fast. During the chaos of the HCF operation, T-virus containment failed across the entire facility. Prisoners, guards, paramilitary personnel, all converted into undead within hours. And the evacuation plan? Remote-controlled carrier planes ferried surviving Umbrella staff to Antarctic research stations. Nobody checked whether those evacuees were infected. Nobody screened the cargo. They just launched planes toward one of the most isolated places on Earth and hoped for the best. They did not get the best. The outbreak spread to Antarctic personnel who had zero knowledge they were standing in a biohazard zone. But the real gut punch is who orchestrated the whole thing: Albert Wesker. Umbrella's top security operative wasn't running a rescue. He wasn't even running damage control. He was systematically extracting viral research data and funneling it to third-party buyers. The HCF infiltration, the evacuation flights, the Antarctic transfer, all of it functioned as one massive intelligence theft operation disguised as institutional chaos. And that's the real horror of December 1998. Raccoon City's destruction didn't end the bioweapon crisis. It shattered it into pieces. Viral materials scattered across the globe, infected specimens moving between continents, and rogue operatives like Wesker operating with zero oversight and every reason to keep the chaos going. There was no centralized authority tracking any of it. But if you think an unmonitored global bioweapon diaspora sounds bad, wait until a South American drug lord gets his hands on one of those scattered viral strains. 2002, South American Operation Javier Hidalgo Incident. 4 years after Raccoon City got nuked off the map, the threat landscape shifted in a way nobody saw coming. It wasn't a corporation running bioweapons anymore. It was a heartbroken drug lord in the Amazon with a briefcase full of T-virus and a vendetta. Javier Hidalgo ran the Amparo region of the Amazon rainforest like his personal kingdom, part cartel, part warlord operation. But the guy wasn't some cartoonish villain. He was a father watching his daughter die. Manuela Hidalgo had a degenerative illness that no conventional treatment could touch. Javier was desperate enough to deal with anyone who promised a cure, and the person who showed up was Albert Wesker. While Umbrella was collapsing in on itself like a dying star, Wesker was moonlighting as a pharmaceutical sales rep for a rival bioweapons company. His pitch? The T. Veronica virus as experimental medicine. The insane part is it actually worked. Manuela's condition stabilized, but the treatment turned her into a viral superhuman whose blood carried natural T. Veronica antibodies. She wasn't just cured, she became the single most valuable biological specimen on the planet. Then Javier lost track of her. He became convinced Umbrella had taken Manuela or killed her, and that conviction turned a grieving father into a bioterrorist. He deliberately released T-virus across the Amparo region, killing hundreds of innocent people in an act of vengeance against a corporation that was already basically dead, the US. As government responded by deploying the Anti-Umbrella Pursuit and Investigation Team under Antivirus Weapon Protocol number 7600, the first dedicated unit built specifically to handle Umbrella-derived bioterrorism. This was the moment the world officially acknowledged that the post-Umbrella era wasn't safer. It was worse. Anyone with black market connections and enough rage could get their hands on a world-ending pathogen. But here's where it gets genuinely painful. During the operation, they found Manuela alive. Javier's daughter had been there the whole time. The reunion should have been a relief, but the US government immediately placed her in permanent federal protective custody. Her antibodies were too valuable. She wasn't a daughter anymore. She was a research asset. Fans still argue about whether Javier is a monster or a desperate father dealt the worst hand imaginable. The honest answer is probably both. He killed hundreds of people for a daughter who was alive, and now the government owns her. But if the Javier incident proved that Umbrella's legacy could turn anyone into a bioterrorist, what happened next proved that Umbrella itself still had one final breath left in it. 2003, Umbrella's final collapse. Picture this, 3 separate armies fighting inside an active bioweapons research facility, and somehow that's not even the most absurd part of how Umbrella ends. In February 2003, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine finally got what they'd been working toward for 5 years. They led a multinational strike force straight into Umbrella Russia. A clandestine research lab disguised as a decommissioned chemical plant kept running through backroom barter deals with Eastern European governments who wanted access to bioweapon tech. This was the last operational Umbrella facility on the planet. The mission was called Umbrella's End, and on paper, it should have been the triumphant finale to half a decade of fighting. But when Chris and Jill's forces breached the facility, Albert Wesker was already inside. He'd arrived with his own private army, completely independent of the international operation, and he wasn't there to destroy anything. He was there to steal. Wesker wanted Umbrella's supercomputer research archives, their viral weaponization protocols, every scrap of data he could extract before the whole place came down. Therefore, the assault devolved into a 3-way war. The international military forces fighting Umbrella's automated defense systems and remaining loyalists, while Wesker's private operatives moved through the chaos grabbing hard drives and research files like it was a clearance sale at the end of the world. And Wesker got what he came for. He successfully extracted significant portions of Umbrella's research archives before the facility was destroyed. But here's where it gets bitter. This wasn't a last-minute heist. Wesker had spent the entire period from 1998 to 2003 systematically looting Umbrella from the inside, stealing viral samples, recruiting specialized personnel, siphoning research data, building an independent bioweapon capability that rivaled entire nation-states. By the time Chris and Jill showed up for the grand finale, Wesker had already hollowed the corporation out like a parasite. And then there's Spencer. Oswell E. Spencer, the founding chairman of Umbrella, the man who started literally all of this, was assassinated by Wesker earlier that same year. Not in some dramatic showdown, not in a burning laboratory. The man who built a global bioweapons empire and orchestrated the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people died in a chair. Wesker killed him and took what was left of his legacy. Symbolic doesn't even begin to cover it, so yes, Umbrella was officially destroyed. The corporation ceased to exist, but its intellectual property, viral strains, and research protocols had already scattered through black market channels so thoroughly that the threat didn't just survive the corporation's death, it metastasized. The world was somehow more dangerous after Umbrella fell than when it was still running, and that new, more dangerous world was about to introduce a threat that had nothing to do with viruses at all. 2004, Los Illuminados cult/rural Spain incident. Up until this point, every single bioweapon in this timeline has been a virus. T-virus, G-virus, T-Veronica, it doesn't matter. They all work the same way. Infect the host, destroy higher brain function, turn them into something mindless and violent. The result is always zombies, monsters, or some grotesque combination of both. But in 2004, something completely different crawled out of a castle basement in rural Spain, and it changed everything. Los Illuminados was a religious cult operating in the Valdelobos region, a remote mountain area so isolated from modern Spain that it might as well have existed in a different century. They claimed to be the continuation of an ancient primal religion predating recorded history, and their weapon of choice wasn't a virus at all. It was Las Plagas, a neurotrophic parasite of extreme antiquity capable of hijacking the human nervous system while leaving the host partially functional. Here's where it gets unsettling. Infected humans, called ganados, could still pick up weapons. They could work in coordinated groups, they could follow orders and communicate with each other. The T-virus made mindless corpses that stumbled toward noise. Las Plagas made an army you could command. The man who unleashed them was Ramon Salazar, the 8th Castellan of Salazar Castle, who was manipulated by cult leader Osmond Sadler into opening sealed caverns beneath his family's estate. Salazar agreed to release fossilized Las Plagas specimens that had been locked underground for potentially thousands of years, framing it as atonement for his ancestors' sins against the faith. He cracked open a tomb that his entire bloodline had spent generations keeping shut. The parasites existed in multiple developmental stages. Early stage organisms stayed dormant inside hosts, quietly establishing nervous system control. But mature specimens could achieve independent mobility after leaving the host body entirely, with some variants undergoing full morphological transformation into combat-capable creatures that operated without any host at all. But here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. Each underground murals discovered in those same caverns depicted the Ndapaya civilization, the same prehistoric people connected to the naturally occurring progenitor virus in West Africa, apparently weaponizing Las Plagas thousands of years ago. Two completely separate civilizations on two different continents with zero shared knowledge, both independently discovered biological warfare and built weapons out of it before recorded history even began, and Los Illuminados achieved parasite weaponization comparable to Umbrella's viral engineering without a single piece of modern laboratory equipment, no billion-dollar research facilities, no government contracts, just a cult, a castle, and something ancient that should have stayed buried. If that tonal shift feels jarring, good, because the timeline is about to get even stranger when bioterrorism hits a floating city in the Mediterranean. 2004 to 2005. Terra Grigia panic and Queen Zenobia incident. Picture a floating city in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Terra Grigia was built as a showcase for humanity's best impulses, a self-sustaining aquapolis powered by advanced solar energy technology, funded by international cooperation, and designed to prove that large-scale renewable infrastructure could actually work. It was beautiful, it was ambitious, and in September 2004, bioterrorists burned it to the ground. The attack came from Il Veltro, a militant organization that opposed Terra Grigia's environmental mission. Their weapon of choice was the T-Abyss virus, a progenitor-derived pathogen engineered in 2003 specifically for aquatic transmission. This thing wasn't like the T-virus. It didn't just infect people. It contaminated entire marine ecosystems, spreading through water systems and into the surrounding Mediterranean with zero realistic containment options. Il Veltro deployed T-Abyss through Terra Grigia's water infrastructure, and within days the floating city was a graveyard, thousands dead, the city abandoned permanently. But here's where it gets so much worse. In 2005, a biological outbreak hit a set of Mediterranean cruise ships, the Queen Zenobia among them, all deliberately infected with the T-Abyss. The investigation into that outbreak cracked open the entire Terra Grigia conspiracy, and what it revealed was genuinely sickening. The man running the international response to the Terra Grigia panic, Federal Bioterrorism Commission Commissioner Morgan Lansdale, was the one who orchestrated the attack in the first place. Lansdale personally personally arranged for Il Veltro to hit Terra Grigia. He manufactured the crisis to generate public terror, then positioned his agency as the only institution capable of responding to it. He maintained exclusive control over the T-Abyss vaccine, turning it into a political weapon he could hold over national governments. Need the cure? Better expand the FBC's budget. Better give Lansdale more authority. The man ostensibly protecting the world from bioterrorism was the bioterrorist. He's more disturbing than most Resident Evil villains because there's nothing supernatural about him. No mutations, no god complex, no ancient parasites. Just a bureaucrat who killed thousands of people to grow his department. But here's the satisfying irony. Then Lansdale's entire strategy depended on monopolizing bioweapon fear, on being the only player in the game. That fell apart when Neo Umbrella demonstrated independent T-virus weapon capability completely outside governmental control. Lansdale's monopolization hadn't prevented proliferation. It had accelerated it by creating demand among non-state actors desperate for defensive capabilities against the very governmental programs he was running. He created the exact nightmare he claimed to be preventing. The FBC was dismantled after Lansdale's exposure, triggering a complete reorganization of international bioterrorism response. But if institutional corruption within the agencies fighting bioterror sounds bad, wait until you see what happens when a multinational corporation decides to run human experiments across an entire African region. 2009, Kijuju Autonomous Zone outbreak. Umbrella died in 2003. The logo changed, the ethics didn't. Starting in the summer of 2008, Tricell Inc., a Fortune 500 multinational corporation, set up shop in the Kijuju region of West Africa. They rolled in with medical outreach programs, free clinics, the whole humanitarian package. But behind every clinic door was a Las Plagas weaponization lab. Tricell recruited impoverished local residents as test subjects, people who thought they were receiving vaccinations or basic health care. They weren't. They were being injected with parasites. This wasn't some rogue scientist operating out of a basement. This was a publicly traded corporation running non-consensual human experimentation on African populations under the cover of pharmaceutical aid. The exact same playbook Umbrella used for decades, just with better branding and a corporate social responsibility page on their website. But here's where it gets worse. When the Ye Nationalist movement, a local independence faction, seized Tricell's research facilities, they didn't shut the experiments down. They weaponized them. The Ye leadership deliberately infected hundreds of Kijuju residents with Las Plagas to build an irregular military force capable of overwhelming government troops and securing regional autonomy. These infected soldiers, called Majini, retained enough cognitive function to use weapons and coordinate tactically, but they hit harder, moved faster, and shrugged off injuries that would drop a normal human. The West African Las Plagas strains produced more aggressive transformations than anything documented in Spain 5 years earlier, suggesting Tricell had been deliberately engineering the parasites for enhanced combat performance before losing control of the program. The BSAA deployed Chris Redfield and Shiva Alamar to lead the response. What followed was approximately 8 months of sustained combat, the longest and most costly bioterrorism response operation on record. The casualty rate among BSAA operators was devastating. The majority of personnel deployed to Kijuju didn't come home. But the real discovery wasn't the Majini. It was what they found inside Tricell's facilities. The investigation uncovered a continental-scale bioweapons smuggling network. Tricell had been coordinating with governments, private military contractors, and organized crime syndicates across multiple continents to traffic weaponized biological agents. This wasn't a rogue operation hidden in a jungle somewhere. This was infrastructure. Supply chains, contracts, post-Umbrella bioweapon proliferation hadn't just survived the corporation's death, it had gone fully mainstream, integrated into the operations of a company with shareholders and quarterly earnings calls. Umbrella built the market. Tricell proved anyone with enough money could run it, and the next incident would prove that even isolated islands weren't safe from what came next. 2011, Sin Island / Suchestvovanie Island incident. Everything up to this point, every outbreak, every incident, every global crisis has followed the same basic playbook. A virus gets out, people mutate, soldiers show up, things explode. But in 2011, the Resident Evil timeline took a hard left into territory that feels less like bioterrorism and more like a Black Mirror episode, because what happened on Sin Island wasn't about infection. It was about copying a human soul. Dr. Alex Wesker, a former Umbrella virologist who vanished after the corporation crumbled, resurfaced on a remote island in the Baltic Sea with a research goal that makes every previous villain look quaint by comparison. She didn't want to build a weapon. She didn't want to sell a virus. She wanted to live forever. Specifically, she wanted to transfer her own consciousness into a younger, healthier body, effectively jumping from one host to another indefinitely, and escaping death entirely through biological body transplantation. And she had the technology to attempt it. Using classified Umbrella research she'd stolen before the company collapsed, Wesker developed a consciousness transfer system that used engineered viruses as encoding vehicles, essentially writing the patterns of a human mind into biological code and then imprinting that code onto a new host organism. 10 members of the TerraSave humanitarian organization were captured and used as experimental subjects alongside prisoners and security personnel. But Wesker's primary target was a 12-year-old girl named Natalia Korda, selected specifically because her psychological profile made her the ideal candidate for hosting a transplanted consciousness. Here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. The procedure worked, partially. Natalia survived the consciousness transfer, but her neurobiology was fundamentally rewritten in the process. She gained the ability to sense nearby mutant organisms through mechanisms that defy any conventional biological explanation. But that wasn't the real cost. The real cost was that Natalia's mind now contains two people. Her original self still exists, but so does a fragmented copy of Alex Wesker's personality, an alternate state Natalia calls Dark Natalia that surfaces unpredictably and operates with its own agenda. This wasn't a virus turning someone into a monster. This was a scientist copying herself into a child's brain. And it raises a question the Resident Evil universe had never confronted before. If someone's mind contains another person's duplicated consciousness, are they still the same person? Is Natalia still Natalia? Or is she slowly becoming Alex Wesker wearing a child's body? Nobody has a good answer. And that's exactly what makes Sign Island the most quietly terrifying incident in this entire timeline. No explosions, no citywide outbreaks, just a girl on an island whose mind isn't entirely her own anymore. But if consciousness transfer sounds like the strangest thing this franchise could throw at you, the very next year brought something far louder, far deadlier, and far more global in scale. 2012 to 2013, global C-virus bioterror attacks. The most dangerous bioterrorist in Resident Evil history isn't a cult leader, a mad scientist, or a rogue corporation. It's the United States National Security Advisor, Derek C. Simmons, held one of the most powerful intelligence positions in the American government, and he used it to run a shadow organization called the Family that had quietly embedded itself into the country's power structure for decades. But Simmons had a problem. President Adam Benford was preparing to publicly reveal the U.S. government's role in the Raccoon City cover-up, a disclosure that would have exposed the family and everything Simmons had built. So Simmons decided the president had to die, and he wasn't going to use a bullet. The weapon he chose was the C-virus, a pathogen so advanced it made every previous bioweapon look primitive. Dr. Carla Radames engineered it by combining a T. veronica derivative with G-virus material harvested from Sherry Birkin's blood. The result was a nightmare hybrid, infected organisms that were strong, fast, and unlike nearly every previous BOW in the franchise, genuinely intelligent. They could coordinate, they could think tactically, they could fight like soldiers. Simmons tested the C-virus during the Edonian Civil War in 2012, deploying it into active combat zones to evaluate its battlefield performance. But that was just the rehearsal. In June 2013, he unleashed the real operation on Tall Oaks. Specialized BOWs called Lopaticas dispersed the C-virus as an aerosol throughout the city, converting approximately 70,000 residents into infected undead within hours. The president was among the first casualties. Mission accomplished, but here's where Simmons' grand conspiracy ran headfirst into someone else's grand conspiracy. During the Tall Oaks attack, a mysterious organization calling itself Neo Umbrella claimed responsibility for simultaneous C-virus deployments across China and multiple Asian countries. Simmons had assumed he held a monopoly on C-virus weaponization. He didn't. An entirely separate terrorist network had independently acquired the same pathogen and was fielding it on a continental scale, completely outside his control. His carefully orchestrated shadow war had competition he never saw coming. The government's response was grimly familiar. On June 30th, 2013, 2 jets destroyed Tall Oaks with thermobaric warheads. That's the second time in this timeline that the American government obliterated one of its own cities with weapons of mass destruction to contain a bioweapon outbreak. An estimated 70,000 infected residents were killed, along with an unknown number of civilians who never got out. Meanwhile, Jake Muller, the son of Albert Wesker, was discovered carrying natural C-virus antibodies inherited through his father's modified genetics. He became the most wanted wanted person on the planet overnight. Simmons intercepted Jake specifically to prevent anyone from developing a vaccine, because a cure would undermine the family's leverage over the C virus entirely. Let that scope sink in for a second. The American National Security Advisor secretly ran biological weapons programs, murdered 70,000 people to assassinate a president, bombed a domestic city to cover the evidence, and still couldn't prevent a completely separate organization from deploying the exact same weapon independently. Every layer of institutional control failed simultaneously. The government wasn't just failing to stop bioterrorism, the government was bioterrorism. But if the C-virus crisis proved that institutions couldn't contain biological threats, the next chapter proved something even more unsettling. That the threats had evolved beyond anything institutions were even designed to fight. 2017 and 2021, the Winters family saga. After 11 eras of corporate greed, military black sites, government cover-ups, and weaponized parasites, the Resident Evil timeline ends with something nobody expected: a grieving mother. Mother Miranda lost her daughter Eva to the Spanish flu. That's it. That's her entire motivation. She wasn't chasing military contracts. She wasn't building a corporate empire. She was a biologist who wandered into a cave system in Eastern Europe, half mad with grief, and stumbled onto something ancient. The Megamycete, a hive-mind fungal organism unlike anything the franchise had ever introduced. Not a virus, not a parasite. A living fungal network capable of detecting when organisms it had infected died, capable of storing consciousness itself. Miranda spent decades experimenting with it, deriving the Kadu parasite from its biology and distributing it through the village she controlled. Most villagers mutated into wolf-like lichens, but 4 subjects responded differently, becoming her lords: Dimitrescu, Moreau, Beneviento, and Heisenberg. Once each granted unique superhuman abilities depending on how their biology interacted with the Kadu. All of it, every experiment, every monstrous transformation, every death in that village, existed for one reason. Miranda wanted her daughter back. But here's where it gets quietly terrifying. In 2017, a derelict tanker called E-001 introduced the world to Eveline, a bioweapon organism developed by classified American programs and lost at sea. Eveline wasn't a pathogen you deployed. She was sentient. She could spread infection through environmental contamination, she could make decisions, and she operated with independent will, a bioweapon that thinks for itself. That's not an escalation. That's an entirely new category of threat. Eveline infected Mia Winters before anyone understood what she was. And because Mia was infected during the conception of her daughter Rosemary, the infant was exposed to bioweapon biology before she was ever born. That made Rosemary extraordinarily valuable, not just to Miranda, who saw the child as a potential vessel for Eva's consciousness, but to every faction that learned she existed. In February 2021, Miranda abducted the infant. Ethan Winters, a civilian with 0 military training and 0 institutional backing, went after her. He fought through Miranda's village, through her infected subjects, through every one of her monstrous lords. And when every government agency, every military response team, every institutional mechanism had failed to stop the Megamycete, Ethan did it himself. He deliberately stayed behind to detonate an N2 explosive charge to destroy the organism at its source. He died saving his daughter. That's how the timeline ends. Not with a special forces operation, not with a thermobaric missile, with a father. And the part that should genuinely unsettle you is what survived. Rosemary Winters inherited superhuman characteristics from her pre-birth Megamycete exposure. The Shadows of Rose narrative confirms it. She didn't choose this. Nobody engineered it on purpose. No corporation signed off on it, no government authorized it. 50 years of Umbrella, of cover-ups, of weaponized viruses spreading across every continent on Earth, and the final result is a child who was born already changed. Bioweapon biology didn't just proliferate into black markets and terrorist cells. It proliferated into human genetics. Future generations may carry inherent viral modifications as standard biological inheritance. Not because someone designed it that way, but because after 5 decades of contamination, it became inevitable. That's the most unsettling conclusion the franchise could have written. Not a monster, not a conspiracy, just a baby who never had a choice. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.